You call that service? The billionaire's voice, smooth as ice, cut right through Clara's starched uniform. Table 7. Trouble. Always. But this wasn't just about a water stain. It was the demeaning words that followed, spoken in her mother's tongue, meant to exclude, to diminish. He thinks she's just a waitress? A clumsy nobody? He has no idea. Rage tightened her chest, but under it, a deeper resolve. She'd spent a lifetime bearing her past. This night, though, a forgotten piece of herself will be unleashed. A quiet lesson in dignity. That tech mogul, so confident in his callousness, he's about to learn that kindness can be a weapon too. But he's really not ready for what's coming. He was speaking to his guest in rapid-fire Japanese, his voice a low, menacing growl. Then he turned his icy gaze on Clara. The words he spat at her, also in Japanese, were filled with such venom, such dismissive cruelty, that the air itself seemed to freeze. He assumed she was just a simple waitress, invisible, uncomprehending. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. Clara Garcia felt like a ghost haunting a palace. For the past 6 months, Arya had been her gilded cage. By day, she was a graduate student buried in linguistic anthropology, textbooks fueled by cheap coffee, and the dwindling funds her father had left her. By night, she donned the starched black uniform and became part of the restaurant's immaculate invisible machinery. Arya wasn't just a restaurant, it was a theater. Located on the 60th floor of a skyscraper overlooking Central Park, its floor-to-ceiling windows presented a panorama of 1,000,000 glittering lives she couldn't fathom. The patrons were the actors, hedge fund titans, aging socialites dripping in diamonds, and tonight the king of them all, Stephen Thorne. Clara knew of him, of course. Who didn't? Thorne Media had devoured the digital landscape. He was a modern-day Midas, but rumor had it his touch was less gold and more ice. At 35, he was notoriously ruthless, brutally efficient, and possessed a store that could curdle cream. Seeing him seated at her best table with its commanding view of the city sent a jolt of pure anxiety through her. His guest was an older, impeccably dressed Japanese man. His face a mask of serene politeness that Clara, from her own experience, knew could hide a universe of disapproval. This was Kenji Yoshida, the chairman of a Japanese electronics giant, Yoshida Corp. The deal Thorne was trying to close with him was legendary in the financial world, a merger that would create an untouchable global tech conglomerate. From the moment they sat, the tension was palpable. Thorne, usually a master of control, seemed agitated. His movements were clipped. His smiles never reached his cold gray eyes. He ordered a 2001 Domaine de la Roman Conti without glancing at the price of a bottle that cost more than Clara's entire semester of tuition. She moved with practiced grace, her steps silent on the plush carpet. She filled their water glasses, presented the wine, and described the evening specials with a soft, professional cadence. All the while, she kept her eyes downcast, her expression neutral. It was the first rule of serving the elite: be present, but not a person. Be a function. Thorne ignored her completely, speaking exclusively to Mr. Yoshida in fluent, aggressive Japanese. Clara felt a strange, dormant part of her mind stir. It was a language she hadn't spoken regularly in a decade, a language that tasted of green tea, cherry blossoms, and a grief so profound she kept it locked away. It was her mother's language. She tried to tune it out, focusing on the rhythm of her duties, but Thorne's Japanese was sharp, almost confrontational. It lacked the subtle dance of respect, the careful ballet of humility and honorifics that was so integral to Japanese business culture. He was speaking it like a weapon, not a bridge. Mr. Yoshida's polite nods became shorter, his smile tighter. He was not impressed. The main courses arrived. Seared A5 Wagyu for Thor, a delicate plate of oro sashimi for Mr. Yoshida. As Clara carefully placed Thorne's plate before him, her sleeve button, which had been loose all night, caught for a split second on the rim of his water glass. The glass tipped, not spilling much, just a small trickle of ice water onto the pristine white tablecloth near his silverware. It was a minuscule error, a mistake that would normally earn a hushed apology and a swift replacement of the linen. But Stephen Thorne was not in a normal mood. The conversation stopped. The silence that fell over table 7 was absolute and terrifying. Thorne slowly turned his head, his gaze landing not on the spill, but on Clara. It was a look of pure, unadulterated disgust, as if she were a roach that had crawled onto his plate. He leaned towards Mr. Yoshida, never breaking eye contact with Clara, and then he spoke in Japanese. The words were quiet, but they sliced through the air with surgical precision. You see, Yoshida-san, he began, his tone dripping with condescension. This is the problem with this country. Incompetence is everywhere. You pay for the best, and you get this. A clumsy, brainless girl who can't even put a plate on a table. She probably can't even count to 10. Absolutely worthless. Every syllable was a hammer blow. He had chosen the language deliberately, creating an exclusive bubble of contempt, a private joke at her expense. He used the most dismissive informal terms for her words that stripped away her dignity, her humanity, reducing her to an object of his irritation. He smiled thinly at Mr. Yoshida, a conspiratorial glint in his eye, expecting a nod of agreement. Mr. Yoshida's expression remained frozen, but a flicker of something discomfort, perhaps even distaste, crossed his face. Clara stood motionless, the heavy plate still in her hands. Her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The heat of humiliation flooded her cheeks. For a moment she was 23 again, a waitress in New York, but for another longer moment she was 13, standing in a small garden in Kyoto, her mother's gentle voice teaching her the nuances of that very same language, a language of respect, of beauty, of poetry. Thorne saw her flushed face and mistook it for shame and fear. He smirked, satisfied with his little display of power. He had put the help in her place. He turned back to his guest, ready to resume his disastrous sales pitch. He never got the chance. The world seemed to slow down. For Clara, the opulent dining room dissolved, the city lights blurred into a distant memory. All that existed was the echo of Stephen Thorne's words reverberating in a chamber of her heart she had sealed off long ago. Clumsy, brainless, worthless. He had said it in her mother's tongue. He had taken something beautiful and sacred and twisted it into a shiv. Her training, her need for this job, the instinct for self-preservation. It all screamed at her to apologize in meek, broken English. Clean up the mess and vanish. Let the insult slide. He was a billionaire. She was a nobody. That was the transaction. They paid for the privilege of treating her as less than human, and she accepted the money to survive. But something else rose up within her, a force she hadn't felt in years. It was the spirit of her mother, a woman who carried herself with the quiet, unshakable dignity of 1,000 years of tradition. It was the pride of her grandfather, the stern but loving calligrapher who taught her that a single misplaced brushstroke could ruin a masterpiece, and that a person without honor was less than nothing. She took a slow, deliberate breath. She could feel the eyes of the other waiters on her, the restaurant manager, Jean-Luc, already starting to move from across the room, his face a thundercloud of impending doom. Stephen Thorne had already dismissed her from his reality. He was picking up his fork when Clara spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence with the clarity of a temple bell. She spoke in perfect, formal Japanese. The accent was not that of a foreigner who had studied the language in a classroom. It was the soft, melodic cadence of the Kanai region, the dialect of Kyoto. It was flawless. Thorne-sama, she began using the most honorific title, one dripping with a politeness so profound it bordered on sarcasm. My deepest apologies for the water. However, the incompetence is not in my hand, but in your words. The fork in Stephen Thorne's hand froze halfway to his mouth. His head snapped up. His eyes widened first in disbelief, then in pure, unadulterated shock. It was as if a statue had just spoken to him. Mr. Yoshida, who had been staring blankly at his plate, slowly lifted his head. A spark of genuine interest ignited in his weary eyes. Clara didn't stop. The words flowed out of her, a dam breaking after a decade of silence. You speak of worthlessness, she continued, her voice, steady and calm, each word carefully chosen. A person's worth is not determined by the balance in their bank account, but by the content of their character and the respect they show to others. A lesson, it seems, you have either forgotten or never learned. She placed his plate down on the table with a soft, deliberate click. She then turned her body slightly to address Mr. Yoshida, directly bowing her head just enough to show respect but not subservience. "Yoshida-sama," she said, her tone shifting to one of genuine deference. "I hope this unpleasant incident has not spoiled your meal. If there is anything I can do to make your experience more comfortable, please do not hesitate to ask." The distinction was brutal. To Yoshida, she offered the grace and respect inherent in his culture. To Thorne, she offered a mirror to his own ugliness. The blood drained from Stephen Thorne's face. He wasn't just embarrassed. He was exposed, in front of the very man he was desperate to impress. His cheap power play had backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. He had tried to use Japanese as a secret code to belittle her, and she had answered from the heart of that code, proving her mastery not just of the language, but of the culture he was so clumsily butchering. Jean-Luc, the manager, had finally arrived at the table, his face pale with horror. He had only heard a waitress speaking in a foreign language to his most important guest. He opened his mouth to fire her on the spot. "Mademoiselle, what is the meaning of silence?" Stephen Thorne hissed, his voice a low rasp. He didn't look at the manager. His eyes were still locked on Clara. The shock was slowly being replaced by a dangerous, unreadable emotion. It wasn't just anger. It was something more complex. It was the look of a man whose entire worldview had just been shattered. He slowly put down his fork and knife, placing them perfectly parallel on his plate. The air crackled. The entire restaurant, it seemed, was holding its breath. Clara met his gaze, her own chin held high. The ghost in the gilded cage had finally found her voice, and now she had no idea if it had just saved her or utterly destroyed her. The silence at table 7 was a living entity. It pulsed with Stephen Thorne's fury, Mr. Yoshida's intrigue, and Jean-Luc's abject terror. The surrounding diners, sensing the gravity of the moment, lowered their voices, their curious glances turning the table into a brightly lit stage. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. The adrenaline that had fueled her defiance began to recede, replaced by a cold dread. What had she done? She had talked back to a billionaire. She had broken the cardinal rule of service invisibility. She mentally started calculating how long it would take to pack up her tiny apartment. Jean-Luc, recovering from Thor's command, took a step forward, his hands clasped nervously. "Mr. Thorne, sir, I am so terribly sorry. Please allow me to handle this. This employee's behavior is inexcusable. She is—" "I told you to be silent." Thorne repeated, his voice dangerously soft. He finally tore his eyes away from Clara to fix them on the manager. "And I told her to speak. Now get away from my table." Jean-Luc froze, his mouth agape. He looked from Thorne's granite expression to Clara's defiant posture. Utterly bewildered, he gave a jerky nod and retreated, his face a mask of confusion and fear. Thorne returned his focus to Clara. The initial shock had receded from his features, replaced by a cold, analytical curiosity. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a waitress, but as a puzzle. "Who are you?" he asked, this time in crisp, unaccented English. Before Clara could answer, Mr. Yoshida cleared his throat softly. He folded his hands on the table and addressed Thorne, but his eyes were on Clara, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "Thorne's son," Mr. Yoshida said in English, his voice calm and measured. "For the past 2 hours, you have spoken to me of synergy, of market disruption, and of global dominance. You have used Japanese words, but you have not spoken a Japanese heart." He gestured gracefully towards Clara. "This young woman, in 2 sentences, has shown more understanding of WA, of harmony and respect, than was present in our entire conversation. Perhaps she is the one I should be in business with." The statement was a tactical nuke dropped in the middle of the dining room. It was a polite, elegantly worded, and utterly devastating critique of Thorne's entire approach. Stephen Thorne, the master negotiator, had been publicly shamed, his cultural ignorance laid bare by a waitress and the very man he was trying to conquer. A dark flush crept up Thorne's neck. He was a man who never lost, who never miscalculated. To be outmaneuvered so completely and so publicly was a new and deeply unpleasant experience. He looked at Clara, then at Mr. Yoshida, and then back at Clara. The gears in his mind were turning. The ruthlessly efficient processor that had built an empire was analyzing a new unexpected variable. "My office tomorrow, 900 a.m., he said to Clara. It wasn't a question or an invitation. It was a command. "Don't be late." He then pushed his chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the floor. He threw his napkin onto the table, the pristine white linen, a flag of surrender. "The meeting is over, Kenji," he said to Mr. Yoshida. The use of his first name, a shocking breach of etiquette. "My people will call your people." Without another word, Stephen Thorne turned and strode out of the restaurant. He didn't wait for his coat, didn't acknowledge the stunned staff, didn't look back. He simply vanished, leaving a vortex of chaos in his wake. Mr. Yoshida watched him go, his expression unreadable. He then turned his gaze back to Clara, who stood rooted to the spot, trembling slightly. He reached into his jacket, produced a business card, and laid it gently on the table. "Young lady," he said, his voice kind, "your Japanese is beautiful. It reminds me of Kyoto in the spring." He bowed his head slightly. "Thank you for the lesson in dignity." He too stood up and walked out, leaving his meal unfinished. Clara was left alone at the table, standing amidst the wreckage of a multi-billion-dollar negotiation. On one side lay Stephen Thorne's implicit threat of a summons. On the other, Kenji Yoshida's business card, a silent testament to her actions. The entire restaurant staff stared at her, their expressions a mixture of awe and terror. Jean-Luc approached her slowly, as if she were an unexploded bomb. "Clara," he whispered, his voice. "What in God's name just happened?" Clara looked down at the table, at the half-eaten wagyu, the untouched sashimi, the small puddle of spilled water that had started it all. She had no idea what had just happened. All she knew was that her life as an invisible ghost was over. Tomorrow at 900 a.m., she had to face the dragon in his lair. The Thorne Media building was a shard of obsidian and steel piercing the Manhattan skyline. It was less a building and more a statement of raw, unapologetic power. As Clara walked into the lobby, she felt her simple black blazer and neatly pressed slacks were woefully inadequate armor. The air hummed with a quiet, ferocious energy. Everyone moved with purpose, their faces etched with the stress and ambition that came from orbiting a sun as demanding as Stephen Thorne. She was escorted to the top floor by a silent security guard. The elevator ascended with a stomach-lurching speed, opening directly into a vast minimalist office. 3 of the walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a god's-eye view of the city. The 4th was a stark white wall adorned with a single magnificent piece of Japanese calligraphy. Its bold black strokes a tempest of controlled energy. Stephen Thorne stood with his back to her, looking out at his kingdom. He wore a perfectly tailored gray suit but had shed the jacket. He didn't turn when she entered. "The view is supposed to be clarifying," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the large space. "It reminds you how small everything else is, how insignificant." Clara remained silent by the door, her bag clutched in her hand. She refused to be intimidated. He finally turned to face her. The anger from last night was gone, replaced by an intense, unnerving focus. His gray eyes scanned her, not with contempt this time, but with the dispassionate gaze of a scientist studying a specimen. "Clara Garcia," he stated, glancing at a file on his massive desk. "Orphaned. Father was a mid-level diplomat. Deceased. Mother Akari Ishikawa, also deceased. You're a graduate student in linguistic anthropology at Columbia. You spent the first 13 years of your life in Kyoto. You are, for all intents and purposes, broke." He recited the facts of her life as if they were a stock report. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. He hadn't just summoned her. He had dissected her life overnight. "Why are you working as a waitress?" he asked, his tone flat. "Student loans are not insignificant, Mr. Thorne," she replied, her voice steady, "and my research requires funds." "And you're Japanese," he pressed, leaning against his desk. "It's not textbook, it's native. You don't just speak the language, you understand the soul behind it." "Where did that come from?" "From my mother," Clara said simply, "and my grandfather." A flicker of something crossed Thorne's face, an emotion she couldn't quite place. Your grandfather Ishikawa, son. It wasn't a question. Clara frowned. How did you know his name? Thorne walked over to the wall with the calligraphy. He reached out and gently traced one of the powerful strokes with his finger. This is his work, he said softly. It's a proverb. Nanakarabi yaoki, fall down 7 times, get up 8. He looked back at her, and for the first time she saw not a billionaire CEO, but a man haunted by something. Your grandfather Kao Ishikawa was my sensei, my mentor. Clara stared at him, her mind reeling. Her grandfather. The quiet, stern man who smelled of ink and old paper, who taught her to see the beauty in imperfection and the strength in stillness. This man, this titan of industry, this ruthless corporate predator, was his student. It was impossible. I was a directionless 19-year-old on a foreign exchange program. Thorne continued his voice, taking on a distant quality. Angry at the world. Your grandfather ran a small dojo and calligraphy school. He took me in. He taught me Japanese, yes, but he tried to teach me more. He taught me discipline, focus. He tried to teach me humility. He gave a short, bitter laugh. I excelled at the first 2. He turned away from the calligraphy and faced her fully. He saw a fire in me, but he also saw a danger. He said my ambition was a blade without a handle, that it would cut me as deeply as it cut my enemies. We had a falling out. I came back to America, built all of this. He gestured to the city below them. I wanted to prove him wrong, to prove that winning was all that mattered. Suddenly, the events of the previous night clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The deal with Yoshida Corp, Clara breathed. It's not just business for you, it's the pinnacle, Thorne admitted, his voice roar with an intensity that startled her. Kao always respected Yoshida-san. He saw him as a man of honor, a true leader. Closing this deal, it was supposed to be my final victory. The moment I could finally mentally tell my old master that his way was sentimental and slow, and my way was the one that conquered the world. He sank into his chair, the powerful facade crumbling for a moment to reveal a deep, profound exhaustion. And I'm failing. Yoshida thinks I'm an arrogant American brute with no respect for his culture. Last night, my treatment of you, it was the final nail in the coffin. He saw in me the very thing your grandfather warned me against. He looked up at her, his gray eyes piercing. And then you spoke. You spoke with Kao's accent. You used the language with his precision, his respect. You channeled the very spirit of the man I've been running from my entire adult life. The room was silent, save for the hum of the city far below. Clara stood before the man she had despised just hours ago and saw him not as a monster, but as a deeply flawed, brilliant, and wounded person, inextricably linked to her own past. Her grandfather, the gentlest soul she had ever known, had mentored this titan of industry. The irony was staggering. What do you want from me? Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Stephen Thorne leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. The billionaire was back, but his eyes held a new desperate light. I want you to help me, he said. Yidin is meeting with his board this afternoon to officially reject our offer. I have one last chance, a final dinner meeting tonight. He respected you. He listened to you. I need you there. Not as a waitress, as a consultant, as a translator, as a bridge. He paused, a look of profound difficulty on his face, as if the words were physically painful to say. Help me understand what your grandfather tried to teach me. Help me save this deal. Clara's mind was a whirlwind. An hour ago, she was worried about paying rent. Now the architect of a global media empire was asking her to salvage a multi-billion-dollar merger rooted in the teachings of her own grandfather. The world had tilted on its axis. Why should I help you? She asked the question, sharp and genuine. Last night, you insulted me. You humiliated me. You saw me as less than whole human. Thorne didn't flinch. He accepted the verbal blow as his due because I was wrong, and because what you said was true. My words lacked worth. My actions lacked respect. I acted like a fool, and it's going to cost me everything I've worked for. He gestured around the opulent office. This isn't just about money, Garcia. This deal is my legacy, It's the validation I've been seeking for 15 years. There was a raw honesty in his voice she didn't expect. He wasn't just manipulating her. He was in his own way confessing. My grandfather, Clara said, thinking aloud, he believed that the way you do anything is the way you do everything. The brushstroke, the bow, the business deal, they are all reflections of the spirit. He would have been ashamed of your behavior last night. I know, Thorne said, his voice quiet. I am ashamed. The admission hung in the air, a shocking moment of vulnerability from a man who seemed to have none. Clara looked at the calligraphy on the wall, her grandfather's powerful, elegant strokes. Fall down 7 times, get up 8. It wasn't just a proverb, it was a philosophy. It was about resilience, but also about the grace to stand up after a fall, to learn to be better. Could Stephen Thorne get up? Show me the proposal, she said. A flicker of surprise, then relief crossed Thorne's face. He slid a thick leather-bound portfolio across the vast desk. It's all in there. The financials, the projections, the synergy reports. It's flawless. Clara opened the document. It was a monument to Western corporate strategy. Charts, graphs, aggressive timelines, and language centered on acquisition dominance and efficiency. It was a predator's manifesto. She spent the next hour reading with Thorne, watching her in silence. She ignored the complex financial models and focused on the language of the executive summary and the cultural integration plan. This is the problem, she said, finally pushing the portfolio back. It's not flawless. It's an insult, Thorne stiffened. It's been vetted by the best M&A team in the world. They may know numbers, but they don't know people. Specifically, they don't know Mr. Yoshida, Clara explained. She stood and walked towards the window, ordering her thoughts. Your entire proposal is framed as a takeover. You use words like acquire, streamline, absorb. You are essentially telling Yoshida Corp that its 70-year history is irrelevant, and you are here to gut it for parts and slap your name on the shell. She turned to face him. You're not proposing a merger. You're announcing a conquest. Thorne was about to argue, but he stopped. He was seeing his own work through a new lens. Yoshida doesn't see his company as a collection of assets. Clara continued, the passion of her academic field infusing her voice. He sees it as a family, a legacy. It carries his father's name. You need to approach him not as a conqueror, but as a suitor asking for his daughter's hand in marriage. This proposal needs to speak of partnership, of mutual respect, of creating a new legacy together. She pointed to a key phrase in the summary. Thorne Media will integrate Yoshida Core legacy hardware divisions. Change it, she commanded. Rewrite it. Say something like, a new entity will be forged, combining the honor and engineering excellence of Yoshida Corp with the innovative agility of Thorne Media. She looked him dead in the eye. It's not about taking, it's about building. That's the language he understands. That's the language my grandfather would have used. For a long moment, Stephen Thorne just stared at her. He, the master of the universe, was being lectured on business strategy by a linguistics student. And the worst part was he knew she was right. His ambition had blinded him to the most fundamental aspect of the deal, the human element. He picked up the phone on his desk. Get the M&A team in the boardroom now and bring Miss Garcia a coffee and anything else she wants. He looked at Clara, a new respect dawning in his eyes. All right, Ms. Garcia, let's rewrite this thing your way. For the rest of the day, the top floor of Thorne Media became a war room. Clara, initially hesitant, found her footing. Surrounded by a dozen stony-faced lawyers and bankers in 1,000 suits, she dissected Thorne's proposal word by word. She wasn't a business expert, but she was an expert in communication in the subtle codes of culture that the team had completely ignored. She had them change synergistic cost-cutting to share deficiencies for sustainable growth. Asset acquisition became stewardship of a combined heritage. She insisted they include a section on preserving the Yoshida brand name in Asia and establishing a co-chaired foundation for technological education in Japan, funded by both companies. The bankers scoffed. The lawyers warned of contractual ambiguities, but Thorne overruled them all. Do as she says, he repeated over and over. He watched her fascinated. She was navigating the treacherous waters of corporate negotiation with an instinctive grace that none of his high-priced experts possessed. She was using her grandfather's wisdom as a compass. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city, they had a new document. It was still a business proposal, but its heart had been transformed. It now spoke of honor, partnership, and a shared future. Thorne looked at the final draft, then at Clara, who was exhausted but resolute. "It's better," he admitted. "It's right," he hesitated. "Will it be enough?" "The words are right," Clara said, gathering her things. "But Yoshida-san won't be looking at the paper. He'll be looking at you. The paper is just a script. Tonight you have to convince him you believe it." The dinner was not at a grand restaurant like Arya. At Clara's suggestion, it was held in a private room at a small traditional Japanese restaurant in a quiet part of the city. The room was serene with tatami mats, a low wooden table, and a single scroll of a mountain landscape on the wall. The air smelled of cedar and green tea. It was a world away from the cold power of Thorne Media. Clara had insisted she attend not as a negotiator, but as a translator and facilitator. She wore a simple, elegant dark blue dress. When Stephen Thorne arrived, he looked different. He had shed the aggressive pinstripes for a conservative dark charcoal suit. His demeanor was subdued, his usual restless energy replaced by a nervous stillness. When Mr. Yoshida arrived with his aide, Thorne stood. He did not extend a hand for a firm American handshake. Instead, following Clara's explicit instructions from their frantic afternoon prep session, he bowed. It wasn't a perfunctory nod of the head. It was a deep, formal bow from the waist, his back straight, his eyes lowered. It was a gesture of profound respect, held for a moment longer than necessary. Clara, standing slightly behind him, also bowed. Mr. Yoshida stopped in the doorway, his eyes widening slightly. He took in the scene, the traditional setting. Thorne's posture, the presence of the young woman from the restaurant. He then returned the bow with equal gravity. No words were spoken, but a message had been sent and received. "I was wrong. I am here to listen." They sat at the low table, a moment of awkwardness for Thorne, who was clearly not used to sitting on the floor. The meal began. It was a multi-course kiseki dinner, a series of small, exquisitely prepared dishes that were as much art as food. Clara guided the conversation. She didn't allow Thorne to launch into his revised pitch. Instead, she started with pleasantries. She asked Mr. Yoshida about his flight. She complimented the restaurant, mentioning that the chef was from the Gillen district of Kyoto, known for its refined cuisine. This led to a brief, pleasant conversation about Kyoto, a city both she and Mr. Yoshida clearly loved. Thorne remained mostly silent following Clara's lead. When he did speak, it was to ask questions, not to make statements. He asked about the history of Yoshida Corp., about Mr. Yoshida's father who had founded it. He listened, truly listened, as the older man spoke with quiet pride about building his company from the ashes of the war. Clara translated not just their words, but their intent. When Thorne said, "That must have been difficult," she translated it with a Japanese phrase that conveyed a deep sense of shared understanding and empathy for that hardship. When Mr. Yoshida spoke of his duty to his employees, she conveyed that to Thorne, not as a business obligation, but as a paternal, almost sacred trust. She was not a machine spitting out dictionary definitions. She was a cultural Lumiere tuning the conversation until it resonated with harmony. Finally, after the main course was cleared, Mr. Yoshida set down his teacup. "Thorne's son," he said, looking at him directly, "my board has advised me to terminate our discussions. They believe your company's culture is incompatible with ours." After our last meeting, I was inclined to agree. He paused, his gaze shifting to Clara for a moment. "But tonight feels different." Why? This was the moment. All the rewritten words, all the cultural coaching, it all came down to this. Stephen Thorne took a deep breath. He did not look at his notes or the new proposal that sat untouched. He looked directly at Mr. Yoshida. "Because I was an arrogant fool, Yoshida," he said, his voice clear and steady. Clara translated his words faithfully, her own heart pounding. "I came to you with a conqueror's mindset. I saw your company as a prize to be won. I was disrespectful to you, to your legacy, and to people who deserve my kindness." His eyes briefly met Clara's. "I was taught better long ago by a man I believe you knew. Kao Ishikawa, The mention of the name caused Mr. Yoshida to sit up straighter. A look of astonishment crossed his face. You knew Ishikawa-sensei. He was my teacher, Thorne said. He tried to teach me that strength without wisdom is just violence, and that success without honor is empty. I spent 15 years trying to prove him wrong. I built an empire to show him my way was better. But in trying to win your company, I almost lost myself. Last night, your waitress, he corrected himself. Ms. Garcia reminded me of his voice. She reminded me what true strength and honor look like. He pushed the new leather portfolio gently across the table. This is a new proposal, he said. It's not about acquisition. It's about a partnership, a true merger of our strengths to build something new, something better for the next 100 years. But honestly, the paper doesn't matter as much as this. He looked Mr. Yoshida in the eye. I am asking for a second chance, not just to do this deal, but to do it the right way, to build a company that Ishikawa-sensei would have been proud of. The room was silent. Mr. Yoshida stared at Thorne, his gaze intense, searching. He then slowly reached out his hand, resting on the portfolio, but he didn't open it. He looked at Clara, then back to Thor. Ishikawa-sensei once told me. Mr. Yoshida said softly that the strongest bamboo is the one that knows how to bend in the wind. He gave a small, genuine smile. It seems a great storm has taught you how to bend. He tapped the portfolio. I will read this, and I will speak to my board again. He stood up and his aide followed. Miss Garcia, he said, bowing to her, you honor your grandfather's memory. Then he looked at Thorne. Thorne's son, I will be in touch. And with that, they were gone. Thorne remained seated, letting out a breath he seemed to have been holding all night. He looked across the table at Clara, his face a mixture of exhaustion and something else. Gratitude. Thank you, he said, the words simple but heavy with meaning. You're the one who spoke from the heart, Mr. Thorne, Clara replied. I just helped you find the right words. She didn't know if the deal was saved, but she knew that something within Stephen Thorne had been the man who had fallen 7 times in arrogance, had perhaps just taken his first step to get up 8. 2 days passed, each stretching into an eternity of agonizing silence. For Clara, it felt like holding her breath underwater, waiting to either surface into a new life or have her lungs burst from the pressure. She tried to return to the familiar rhythms of her existence, but the world had been rendered in a different color palette. She sat in a Columbia lecture hall listening to her professor deconstruct the semiotics of cultural exchange, a topic that was once a fascinating abstraction, but now felt like a raw, lived experience. The theories on the slides felt like pale ghosts compared to the visceral reality of facing Stephen Thorne's ambition and Kenji Yoshida's profound sense of honor. Her tiny apartment, once a cozy sanctuary, now felt like a waiting room. The stacks of books on linguistic theory seemed to mock her. What good were they really when she had gambled her future, not on academic rigor, but on the remembered wisdom of her grandfather, and a gut feeling about a man's soul? The doubt was a creeping vine. Had she been naive? Had Thorne's performance of humility simply been another calculated tactic, one that Mr. Yoshida had seen through in the sober light of day? She pictured the deal collapsing. Thorne's formidable anger turning on her, the single convenient scapegoat for his failure. Every buzz of her phone sent a spike of adrenaline through her veins, a jolt of pure dread. She received a text from Jean-Luc, the manager from Aria. Just checking in. Heard some crazy rumors. Hope you're okay. She stared at the message, unable to formulate a reply. How could she explain that she had gone from being his most problematic waitress to the potential linchpin in a multi-billion-dollar merger in the span of a single evening? Her old life felt a million miles away, yet her new one was still a phantom, a tantalizing and terrifying possibility. On the third morning, as she was nursing a cup of coffee and staring blankly at a half-written essay, her phone rang. The number was blocked, a string of anonymous digits that made her heart hammer against her ribs. This was it. She took a deep, shuddering breath and answered her voice a ready whisper. Hello, Miss Clara Garcia, a crisp, impossibly professional female voice inquired. Speaking, Clara managed. Please hold for Mr. Stephen Thorne. The wait was only a few seconds, but in that sliver of time, Clara's mind raced through 1,000 disastrous outcomes. Then his voice came on the line, and all her expectations shattered. It wasn't the cold cutting tone from the restaurant, nor the desperate raw voice from his office. This was something new. The sharp, aggressive edges had been sanded away, leaving a sense of calm, profound exhaustion, and something that sounded almost like peace. Clara. He began the use of her first name, feeling both startlingly intimate and perfectly natural. The dust has settled. Clara gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles white, and she breathed, unable to ask the full question. There was a slight pause, and she could hear the faint smile in his voice when he finally spoke. He signed. The words didn't register at first. They were just sounds. Then their meaning crashed over her, a tidal wave of relief so potent it made her dizzy. She sank onto her small sofa, the phone still pressed to her ear. He, Mr. Yoshida, signed the deal, she repeated, needing to hear it again to believe it. This morning at dawn Tokyo time, Thorne confirmed. His official statement to the board commended the new proposal. He said it laid a foundation of mutual respect. His words, Clara. There was another pause, this one filled with a weight of unspoken acknowledgement. Our words. A single tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or even pure joy, but of a complex, overwhelming catharsis. Congratulations, Mr. Thorne. Stephen, the congratulations belong to you too, he said, his tone serious now. Which is why I'm calling. What I offered you was a one-time consulting fee for an evening's work. That's no longer sufficient. This isn't over. In truth, it's just beginning. He began to paint a picture for her, not of a victory, but of a colossal challenge, merging these companies, these two corporate empires, from opposite ends of the earth. It's going to be a minefield. We need to integrate HR policies, R&D philosophies, marketing strategies. Yoshida's team values lifetime loyalty and slow consensus-based decisions. My team values disruptive speed and individual merit. It's a clash of titans, and without the right guidance, it will tear itself apart within a year. I don't just need a translator, Clara. I need an architect. I need a bridge. Frankly, I need a conscience. I need someone in the room who isn't afraid to tell me I'm being an arrogant fool. Clara's mind was spinning. She was trying to keep up, but he was moving far beyond anything she had ever considered. I am creating a new C-White position, he announced the statement, landing with the force of a physical blow. Executive Vice President, Head of Cultural Integration and Communications for the Thorne-Yoshida Partnership. The role will report directly to me and to Yoshida's chosen representative. It will involve overseeing the entire merger from a human and cultural perspective, liaising between the Tokyo and New York headquarters, and creating a unified corporate philosophy built on the principles we laid out in that proposal. It requires absolute fluency in both languages and a deep, intuitive understanding of both cultures. It requires, he let the sentence hang in the air. Well, it requires you. Clara was utterly speechless. A wave of vertigo swept over her. It was one thing to give advice in a moment of crisis. It was another thing entirely to be handed the reins. Stephen, I'm a student. She stammered the words, feeling flimsy and ridiculous. My experience is in a library and a restaurant. I don't have an MBA. I've never even worked in an office. I have a building full of people with MBAs from Harvard and Wharton. Thorne countered instantly, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. They can build financial models in their sleep, but they can't build this. They see spreadsheets. You see people. They see assets. You see legacy. Your entire academic career is about understanding exactly this, how culture shapes communication. You don't need a business degree. You are the asset we've been missing. He paused, then delivered the final undeniable blow. The starting salary is $750,000 a year plus stock options. We will fund the completion of your doctorate. We will build the entire department around you. I don't care about your experience. I care about your perspective. Just say yes. The number was so vast, so astronomical, that it didn't even sound real. It was an escape velocity. It was the end of debt, the end of fear, the end of the constant grinding struggle that had defined her entire adult life. He was offering her not just a job, but a different reality. She looked across her small room to the faded photograph on her desk. It showed her as a little girl standing between her smiling mother and her stern, proud grandfather in their Kyoto garden. For so long, her identity had felt like a fracture, a painful split between two worlds. She was too American for her Japanese relatives, too Japanese for her American friends. She had carried her heritage like a secret, a ghost. Now Stephen Thorne was telling her that this very fracture, this unique bicultural perspective, was her single greatest strength. It wasn't a flaw to be hidden. It was a superpower. Her grandfather had taught her that a person's path is not a straight line but a circle, and that eventually we all find our way back to the beginning. She had run from her past, from the language and culture that was tied to her grief. And now, by finally embracing it, she was stepping into a future she could never have dared to imagine. Yes, she said, her voice no longer a whisper, but clear and firm. Yes, Mr. Thorne, I accept. 1 month later, Clara stood in a corner office on the top floor of the Thorne Media Building, just down the hall from Stevens. The view of Central Park was breathtaking, a living tapestry of green and gold. Her uniform was no longer a starched black apron, but a sharply tailored gray suit that made her feel both powerful and poised. The office was still sparse, but she had added her own touches. On her desk, next to a state-of-the-art computer, sat the framed photograph from her apartment. On the wall behind her, she had hung not a corporate mission statement, but a large framed piece of calligraphy she had brushed herself. The door opened, and Stephen walked in, not with a command, but with 2 steaming cups of coffee. He placed one on her desk, a simple ritual they had developed that spoke volumes more than words. He had changed. The frantic, predatory energy was gone, replaced by a focused, more deliberate intensity. He seemed to have finally learned the difference between motion and direction. He followed her gaze to the calligraphy on the wall. It was a single, elegant, and powerful character. Wah, Harmony. He would be proud of you. You know, Stephen said softly, his eyes on the bold brush strokes. Your grandfather, Clara turned from the window, a small, knowing smile on her face as she looked at her new partner. I think, she said, her voice filled with a quiet confidence that had been forged in fire. He would be proud of us. She looked from Stephen's face to the symbol on the wall and then out at the sprawling city below. We fell. Now we get up together. We're learning that harmony isn't the absence of different notes, but the art of playing them together to create a beautiful chord. And so a moment of cruel arrogance in a high-end restaurant became the unlikely beginning of a powerful partnership. It's a story that reminds us that beneath the surface of every person, whether they're a billionaire CEO or a struggling waitress, lies a hidden history, a secret strength. Clara didn't just know a language. She embodied a culture of respect that humbled a titan. Stephen Thorne wasn't just a ruthless businessman. He was a lost student who finally remembered his master's most important lesson. Their story proves that the best deals aren't just about money, but about understanding, and that our greatest moments of growth often begin when we are forced to see the world through someone else's eyes. If this story of redemption and unexpected turns moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that remind us that there's always more to people than meets the eye. Let us know in the comments, what hidden skill do you have that would surprise everyone?